China's GDP per capita 1960-1978 poverty, survival and pre-reform economic gauge. Between 1960 and 1978, China existed inside a closed, rigid and brutally constrained economic system. GDP per capita during this period wasn't merely low, it was numerically expression of systematic suffocation. These 18 years represent the final phase of Maoist economic organization, a period defined by ideological dominance over efficiency, political campaigns over incentives, and survival over prosperity. To understand China's later explosion in growth, one must first understand how poor, stagnant, and structurally trapped the country actually was on the eve of reform. In 1960, China's GDP per capita, in contrast, inflation-adjusted terms, stood at roughly $240, which is today's term would be roughly $240 according to 2010 USD. This number immediately collapsed in the early 1960s, falling below 170 by 1962. This was not a normal cyclical downturn, it was an economic scar of the Great Leap Forward, one of the most destructive economic experiences in modern history. Agricultural collectivization, backyard steel campaigns, falsified output reporting, and the dismantling of household incentives destroyed food production. Tens of millions died. GDP per capita from these years reflects not only abstract economies but mass starvation and institutional failure. What matters is not that output fell, but why it fell. China's economy at the time lacked three foundational mechanisms of growth: price signals, price incentives, and capital accumulation autonomy. Production targets were political, not economic. Grain procurement quotas ignored real harvests. Labor allocation followed ideological enthusiasm rather than productivity. As a result, per capita output collapsed even when the state claimed resources success. When the state claimed success, GDP per capita numbers from 1960 to 62 are therefore not just low, they are evidence of informational blindness embedded in the system. From 1963 onward, GDP per capita slowly recovered, rising back above 200 by the mid 1960s and reaching around 250 to 260 by 1966. This recovery coincided with partial threat from the most extreme leap policies. Communes remained, but some household plots returned. Cadres quietly tolerated incentive mechanisms. The state never admitted failure, but the behavior adjusted. Growth resumed at a glacial pace. Then came the Cultural Revolution between 1966 to 76, which froze China's economic potential for an entire decade. GDP per capita during this era fluctuated but remained trapped in narrow band. By 1970, it reached around 287. By 1975, about 342, and by 1978, roughly 386. This figure showed growth, but this growth was painfully slow, inconsistent, and fragile. Over nearly 2 decades, China's per capita income increased by barely $140 in real terms. This is not development, this is endurance. The structural reasons for this stagnation are clear and unforgiving. First, capital formation was mislocated. Heavy industry was prioritized regardless of return, while consumer goods and agriculture were neglected. Second, human capital was actively destroyed. Universities were shut down, intellectuals were purged, technical expertise was replaced by political loyalty. Third, external isolation cut China off from technology transfer, global markets, and productivity spillovers. While East Asia industrialized through export-led growth, China deliberately sealed itself off. GDP per capita is a blunt metric, but in this case it is brutally honest. It tells us that despite massive population mobilization, despite ideological unity, despite total state control, China could not generate meaningful per person wealth. The government grew in size only because the population grew. Productive gains were minimal. Living standards were barely improved. Rural poverty remained dominant. Consumption was suppressed by design. Equality existed, but it was equality at the bottom. By 1978, on the eve of Deng Xiaoping's reform, China's GDP per capita was still lower than that of many African and South Asian countries. The fact that in retrospective Triumphalism. China didn't reform from strength, it reformed from near failure. The pre-1978 data proves that the Maoist economic model had reached a hard ceiling. No further ideological tightening could extract more output. The system had exhausted its ability to mobilize labor without incentives. This is why the post-1978 break matters so much. When China introduced household responsibilities in agriculture, allowed price dualism, welcomed foreign capital, and permitted private initiative, GDP per capita didn't merely rise, it escaped the historical cage visible in the 1960-78 data. The flat, struggling line of those years existed as baseline of what China was without markets, incentives, and openness. In strategic terms, the 1960 to 78 GDP per capita trajectory is a lesson in power economics. States cannot command prosperity by will alone. Control without feedback produces blindness. Equality without incentive produces stagnation. Autarky without innovation reduces poverty. Autarky without innovation produces poverty. China learned this the hard way. Over 18 wasted years measured in hundreds and millions of constrained lives. The line chart from 1960 to 1978 is therefore not a statistical artifact, it's a warning. It shows what happens when ideology dominates economics, when politics overrides productivity, when a civilization as vast as China is locked into a system that cannot compound. Everything that followed after 1978, every factory, every export zone, every infrastructure surge, stands in the contrast to this era. The pre-reform GDP per capita line is flat not because China lacked people or effort, because it lacked economic truth.